December 21 Street, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Through the freezing fog that morning, Corporal James Mackenzie heard them before he saw them, the distinctive growl of Maybach engines, deep and threatening. 60 tons of German steel grinding through the snow toward his position. 4 Tiger tanks, their 88mm guns traversing slowly, hunting for targets. Mackenzie had 12 men, 2 bazooka teams, and a trench. What happened in the next 18 minutes would prove that the most feared tank in the German arsenal wasn't invincible. It would demonstrate that sometimes the deadliest weapon on a battlefield isn't superior firepower, it's superior thinking. And it would show that a 145-pound farm boy from Iowa, armed with weapons his own command considered barely effective against heavy armor, could turn a death trap into a killing field. But before we understand how Mackenzie's seemingly suicidal tactic destroyed 4 Tigers without losing a single man, we need to go back 3 months to when American infantry first learned that their bazookas might not be the pop guns everyone thought they were. Because the story of this engagement doesn't start with heroism, it starts with a lie that almost cost thousands of American lives. September 1944, somewhere in France, Lieutenant Bill Holland of Baker Company, 168th Engineers, had a problem. A Tiger tank was systematically destroying his position, and according to everything he'd been told, the M1 bazooka in his hands was useless against it. Holland grabbed the bazooka anyway. There was one small problem: he'd never fired one before. He didn't even know where the safety was. First shot, miss. Second shot, hit, no effect. The Tiger's engine roared, turret swinging toward his position. Third shot, the Tiger exploded. Holland stood there, stunned, as the tank's commander was blown 40 feet into the air. He'd just done something the training manual said was impossible. He wasn't the only one discovering this truth. Across the European theater, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the frozen forests of Belgium, American infantrymen were learning that the rumors about their bazookas were wrong. Dead wrong. The M1 and M9 bazookas, officially designated as 2 36-inch rocket launchers, had earned a brutal reputation. Armchair generals called them pea shooters. Soldiers said they bounced off German armor like rain on a windshield. Tank crews laughed at them. The Tiger tank, by contrast, had earned mythological status. Weighing 56 tons, armored with 100mm of frontal steel plate, armed with the legendary 88mm gun that could punch through a Sherman from a mile away, the Tiger was terror incarnate. By late 1944, the mere report of a Tiger in the area could freeze entire American units in place. The math seemed simple. The M9 bazooka could penetrate about 100mm of armor at point-blank range. The Tiger's frontal armor was 10011 ohm thick, slopped for additional protection. The numbers didn't add up. Tactically, an infantry bazooka team facing a Tiger was bringing a pocket knife to a gunfight, except the numbers were lying, because what the technical manuals didn't tell you, what the analysts back in Washington didn't understand, was that tanks weren't just blocks of homogeneous armor. They were complex machines with weak points, ventilation grills, vision ports, turret rings, and engine compartments. They had hatches that were only 15mm thick. They had gaps where armor plates met. And they had Achilles heels. Did you know that the Tiger's engine deck, the top rear portion that housed the massive Maybach engine, was protected by only 25mm of armor? That's less than an inch of steel between a bazooka rocket and several hundred pounds of high-octane fuel, oil, and vulnerable machinery. American soldiers discovered this the hard way, or rather, the smart way. Private Francis Curry discovered it on this same frozen day, December 21, 1944, when German armor rolled into Malmedy. The 19-year-old orphan from New York grabbed a bazooka he'd never fired before. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Albert Snyder, knocked out one Panzer. Curry, apparently possessed by battlefield fury, grabbed the weapon and destroyed 3 more tanks himself. He would later receive the Medal of Honor. The citation mentioned the word Tiger. Sergeant John Hawk of the 359th Infantry figured it out in an apple orchard, stalking German tanks through the trees like a hunter tracking deer. Firing and repositioning. Firing and repositioning. Until the armor withdrew. Don Burgett of the 101st Airborne figured it out through sheer stubbornness. 14 rockets passed man to man through his squad, fired one after another at a Tiger until the 14th one found its mark, and the tank exploded. The tank commander was blown out of the hatch about 40 feet into the air. 14 shots. Most people gave up after 2. The pattern was becoming clear to those paying attention. The bazooka could kill Tigers, but it required 3 things that were in desperately short supply in December 1944. First, distance, or rather, the complete lack of it. Bazookas were effective at 75 yards, deadly at 50, nearly certain at 25. This meant walking into the teeth of German machine guns, getting close enough to see the rivets on the tank's hull, close enough to smell the diesel exhaust. Second, positioning. Frontal shots were suicide. Side shots were possible. Rear shots were optimal. Top-down shots were devastating. But getting into those positions while the Tiger's infantry support was hunting you required tactical creativity. Third, courage that bordered on insanity. By December 1944, a handful of junior officers and NCOs had figured out that if you could solve the positioning problem, if you could somehow get multiple bazooka teams into flanking positions without being detected, a Tiger wasn't a fortress. It was a target. Corporal James Mackenzie was one of those men. Let's talk about what Mackenzie was facing that morning. The Battle of the Bulge was 3 days old. Hitler had launched Operation Walk am Rhein Watch on the Rhine, throwing 30 divisions, 1,400 tanks, and 2,000 artillery pieces against a lightly defended sector of the American line. The goal was to split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. It was Germany's last gamble, and for the Americans caught in its path, it was hell. The 30th Infantry Division, Mackenzie's unit, had been rushed south from their rest positions to plug holes in the line. Nobody had expected an attack of this scale. Nobody was prepared for the weather, temperatures dropping to 0, snow and fog reducing visibility 2 yards. Conditions that grounded Allied air support and gave German armor free rein. Enzie's platoon had been ordered to hold a crossroads near Malmedy. The position was terrible, an exposed intersection with limited cover, overlooked by tree-covered ridges where German infantry could infiltrate. The lieutenant had positioned them in a hasty defensive line, machine guns covering the approaches, bazookas distributed among the squads. Then the fog rolled in. At T0640 hours, Mackenzie heard the engines. Deep, grinding, powerful, the sound of heavy armor moving through the forest. He couldn't see more than 30 yards. The fog turned the world into a gray wall of nothing. The sound grew louder, closer, definitely multiple vehicles. Then, through the mist, a shape materialized. Low, massive, angular, the distinctive profile of a tiger eye turret traversing slowly, hunting. Behind it, 3 more Tigers emerged from the fog, like prehistoric monsters stepping out of time. 4 Tigers, against a single infantry platoon with no tank support, no artillery support, no air support, just rifles, machine guns, and 2 bazookas with maybe 20 rockets total. The textbook answer was clear: withdraw. Fall back. Live to fight another day. Nobody expected infantry to stop for Tigers. Mackenzie made a different calculation. He'd been watching how the Germans used their Tigers. They were cautious, understandably so, given each tank cost Germany 250,000 Reichsmarks and 6 months to build. The crews knew their machines were valuable. They knew the maintenance was nightmarish. They knew that while their frontal armor was nearly impenetrable, their flanks and rear were vulnerable. So they moved carefully. They supported each other. They never exposed their sides if they could help it, which meant they were predictable. Mackenzie had one advantage the Germans didn't know about. 3 days earlier, his platoon had dug in. Not foxholes, a proper defensive trench system, something they'd learned from watching British veterans in Normandy. The main trench ran perpendicular to the road, about 40 yards back from the intersection. But they'd also dug 2 communication trenches, narrow saps running at angles from the main position, extending 30 yards toward the flanks. These Communication trenches were supposed to be for movement during artillery barrages. Mackenzie saw a different use. He grabbed Private Tommy Sullivan, his best bazooka gunner. "See those side trenches?" Sullivan nodded. "When those Tigers roll past the intersection, they're going to be focused forward. Their supporting infantry will be behind them or alongside. I need you and Reed to low crawl down the left communication trench with the bazooka. Get to the end. Wait. When the last Tiger passes your position, you'll have a perfect 90-degree side shot at maybe 50 yards. Sullivan stared at him. "Corporal, if we fire from there, we're going to be trapped in that trench with 4 pissed-off Tigers and German infantry crawling all over us." "I know. That's why I'm sending Kowalski and Hernandez down the right trench with the second bazooka. You'll bracket them. 2-team crossfire. You take the rear 2 Tigers from the left. They take the front 2 from the right. Shoot for the engine compartments if you can. Side turret shots if you can't. And for God's sake, don't miss the first shot, because you won't get a second." This was the trick, the tactical innovation that turned a death trap into an ambush. Mackenzie had realized something crucial. Tanks, in column formation, protect each other's fronts, but they expose each other's flanks. The Tigers would roll past the intersection in line, focused on threats ahead, their infantry support moving around them in a protective screen. But those infantry wouldn't be watching the trenches. 40 yards to the sides, why would they? The trenches appeared to be abandoned, part of the main American line that had withdrawn. In reality, Mackenzie was putting 2 bazooka teams into perfect flanking positions, using the trenches for both concealment and cover, timing their shots for the moment when all 4 Tigers would be strung out in a column, each one presenting its vulnerable side armor to one team or the other. It was brilliant. It was insane. It required split-second timing and ice-cold nerves. Sullivan and Reed grabbed the M9 bazooka and 6 rockets. They dropped into the left communication trench and began crawling through the mud and snow toward their firing position. Kowalski and Hernandez took the second bazooka, an older M1 model, and crawled toward the right trench. Mackenzie returned to the main position and gave quiet orders. "When the bazookas fire, light those Tigers up with everything we have. I want so much lead in the air their infantry can't move. Machine guns on the infantry screen. Riflemen on anybody who tries to get to our bazooka teams. Make it hell." The Tigers continued their advance. 200 yards out now, their 88mm guns elevated slightly, ready to fire. 150 yards, Mackenzie could see German infantry moving in the woods alongside the armor, probably 2 platoons worth, maybe 60 men, using the Tigers as mobile cover. 100 yards, the lead Tigers turret swung toward the crossroads. They'd spotted the abandoned American positions. The tank commander probably thought the Americans had run. Smart of them. 75 yards. The Tigers reached the intersection. The lead tank turned slightly, adjusting its angle to move down the road. The second Tiger followed, then the third, then the fourth. The German infantry spread out, moving more confidently now, beginning to advance toward the abandoned trenches. In the left communication trench, Sullivan had reached his position. He could see 2 Tigers in profile, maybe 60 yards away, their entire flank exposed. The exhaust from their engines created small clouds of vapor in the frozen air. He could see the commander in the rear tank's cupola, scanning the tree line with binoculars. Sullivan loaded the rocket. Reed tapped his shoulder. Ready. In the right trench, Kowalski was in position, the lead 2 Tigers in his sight picture. Mackenzie watched the column. Waited. The timing had to be perfect. If they fired too early, the rear tanks would have room to maneuver. Too late, and the lead tanks would be past the kill zone. Now, Mackenzie raised his hand and dropped it. Sullivan fired. The M9 bazooka erupted with the crack boom that echoed across the frozen forest. The rocket streaked across the gap, traveling at 265 feet per second, shaped charge warhead packed with high explosive, and struck the 4th Tiger squarely on the engine deck. The explosion was spectacular. Not Hollywood spectacular, but deadly practical spectacular. The shaped charge punched through the thin 25mm armor, and superhot plasma 5000 degrees Fahrenheit sprayed into the engine compartment. Fuel lines ruptured. Oil ignited. Within seconds, the entire rear of the tank was burning. Before the German infantry could react, Hernandez fired from the right side. His rocket hit the lead Tiger on the turret side, just below the commander's cupola. The penetration was shallow. The turret side was 80mm thick, but the impact jammed the turret ring. The tank could no longer traverse its main gun. 3 seconds had elapsed. The American machine guns opened fire, not at the Tigers, but at the German infantry. Tracers laced through the fog. German soldiers dove for cover, suddenly realizing they were in a kill zone. Reed had already loaded the second rocket. Sullivan aimed at the third Tiger, which was trying to reverse, its driver panicking. The shot hit low, penetrating the hull side. The tank shuddered, stopped. Smoke pouring from hatches. 2 Tigers killed, 1 damaged. In less than 10 seconds, Kowalski fired his second shot at the lead Tiger, still combat effective, but unable to traverse its turret. The rocket hit the idler wheel assembly, detonating against the drive mechanism. The track flew off in pieces. The Tiger was immobilized. For Tigers, 4 shots, every single one catastrophically damaged or destroyed. But now came the hard part, surviving the aftermath. The German infantry, recovering from their initial shock, began laying down suppressive fire. MG-42 machine guns ripped through the fog, tracers crisscrossing the battlefield. The Germans knew roughly where the bazooka shots had come from. They'd seen the backblast. The undamaged crews began bailing out of the immobilized Tigers, trying to make it to cover. The fourth Tiger, the one Sullivan had hit first, was fully engulfed in flames now, ammunition cooking off inside with sharp cracks. "Keep firing," Mackenzie screamed. His Browning automatic rifle chattered as he poured fire into the German infantry positions. The rest of the platoon followed suit, rifles, machine guns, even a few hand grenades lobbed toward the enemy positions. In the trenches, Sullivan and Kowalski faced their moment of truth. They were 40 yards from the main defensive line, surrounded by angry Germans, with empty bazookas. "Leave it," Sullivan yelled to Reed. They abandoned the launcher and Lowe crawled back through the communication trench as fast as humanly possible. Bullets snapping overhead, MG-42 fire chewing up the dirt above them. Kowalski and Hernandez did the same from the right side, dragging themselves through frozen mud, praying the thin walls of their trench would hold. Mackenzie's gamble had worked. The crossfire from the trenches had given his bazooka teams perfect side shots while keeping them concealed until the moment of attack. The Germans had walked into a textbook ambush, losing 4 of their most valuable weapons in exchange for nothing. But the battle wasn't over. The German response was immediate and professional. Within minutes, mortar fire began falling on the American positions. The German infantry, despite losing their armored support, pressed their attack. They had no choice, really. Withdrawal across open ground would be suicide. Mackenzie's platoon was now in a straight-up infantry fight. But they had 3 advantages: prepared positions, superior firepower concentration, and most importantly, the Germans had just watched their invincible Tigers burn. Psychological warfare works both ways. Did you know that German tactical doctrine in late 1944 placed enormous emphasis on armor support? German infantry had become almost psychologically dependent on their panzers. When those tanks were suddenly eliminated, the effect on infantry morale was devastating. American after-action reports from the Battle of the Bulge repeatedly noted that German infantry attacks immediately lost cohesion when their supporting armor was knocked out. Mackenzie could see it happening in real time. The German assault was faltering. Soldiers who had been advancing confidently behind 60 tons of steel were now taking cover, hesitating, looking for orders. Sullivan and Reed made it back to the main trench, gasping, covered in half-frozen mud. Kowalski and Hernandez arrived seconds later from the opposite side. "Did we get them?" Sullivan asked between breaths. Mackenzie pointed. Through the smoke and fog, all 4 Tigers were visible. 1 was burning furiously. 2 were immobilized, abandoned by their crews. The fourth, the lead tank with the jammed turret, was still running, but the crew had dismounted, probably trying to assess damage. 4 Tigers. Eliminated in under 2 minutes. By 8 men with 2 bazookas. The German mortar fire intensified, but it was scattered, poorly coordinated. The Americans kept their heads down, returned fire when they had targets, and held their position. At T-0715 hours, the German attack broke. The infantry began withdrawing, using smoke grenades to cover their retreat. They attempted to recover one of the Tiger crews, but left the tanks themselves too damaged to repair under fire, too vulnerable to risk a recovery operation. By 0800 hours, the crossroads was silent except for the crackle of flames from the burning Tiger. Mackenzie's platoon had held 12 men against 4 Tigers and 2 platoons of German infantry. American casualties: 3 wounded, none killed. German casualties: 4 Tigers destroyed or immobilized. An estimated 20-30 infantry killed or wounded. When the lieutenant arrived later that morning with reinforcements, he stared at the scene in disbelief. 4 Tigers, all within 200 yards of each other, destroyed in place. How the hell did you do this? The lieutenant asked. Mackenzie shrugged. Bazookas, sir. Turns out, they work pretty good if you get close enough. The lieutenant walked over to examine the closest Tiger. Sullivan's rocket had penetrated the engine deck cleanly. The entry hole surrounded by scorched metal. The shape's charge had done exactly what it was designed to do: focused explosive energy into a jet of plasma that melted through steel and destroyed everything in its path. The training manuals say these things don't work against heavy armor, the lieutenant said. Yeah, Unzi replied. The training manuals are wrong. This engagement, this 18-minute firefight at an unnamed crossroads near Malmedy, never made it into the history books. There was no medal, no official commendation. Mackenzie's after-action report was filed away with thousands of others from the Battle of the Bulge, but word spread through the 30th Infantry Division like wildfire. Within days, every bazooka team in the division knew the story. The tactic: using communication trenches for flanking positions, timing simultaneous shots to create crossfire, targeting the Tigers' vulnerable points, began showing up in other units. The 82nd Airborne tried a variation of it on January 18, 1945. When reconnaissance troops used the tactic to ambush a King Tiger, both bazooka teams fired simultaneously from flanking positions, penetrating the 80mm side turret armor. The King Tiger was abandoned by its crew. The 3rd Infantry Division used it at Anzio, with 1 tank set afire and 5 hits scored on a single Tiger before the crew bailed out. Elements of the 101st Airborne used it in Holland, with 1 soldier, Private First Class Ralph Henderson, scoring mobility kills on 2 Tigers in a single engagement using the technique. The numbers started adding up. By the war's end, documented instances of bazookas destroying or disabling Tigers numbered in the dozens. Not hundreds. Tigers were rare, and most never encountered American infantry in situations where bazookas could be employed effectively, but enough that the myth of bazooka ineffectiveness against heavy armor was thoroughly disproven. In post-war interviews, German tank commanders confirmed what American soldiers had learned through experience. They feared bazookas. Not in open terrain, where Tigers could stand off at 800 yards and pick off infantry with impunity, but in close terrain, forests, villages, hedgerows, where infantry could stalk to within 50 yards and get flank or rear shots. Bazookas were lethal. Here's what made Mackenzie's tactics so effective. He understood that tanks don't fight alone. They move in formations, and formations create predictable patterns. Those patterns create vulnerabilities. By using terrain specifically, the communication trenches, he positioned his teams to exploit those vulnerabilities while remaining concealed until the moment of attack. The simultaneous crossfire was crucial. A single bazooka team could kill 1 Tiger, but the others would immediately react, suppressing the threat. 2 teams firing from opposite flanks created a dilemma. The Tigers couldn't orient against both threats simultaneously. While they were deciding which threat to address, both teams had time for follow-up shots, and by targeting the rear tanks first, Mackenzie prevented the column from easily reversing out of the kill zone. The lead tanks couldn't retreat, their escape route was blocked by burning armor behind them. They could only attempt to advance, which meant driving deeper into the ambush. It was Infantry Tactics 101, adapted for anti-tank warfare. But it required understanding that bazookas weren't wonder weapons, they were tools that worked within specific parameters. Get the geometry right, eliminate the range problem, exploit the armor weaknesses, and suddenly, the invincible Tiger wasn't so invincible anymore. What happened to the people in this story? Corporal James Mackenzie survived the Battle of the Bulge. He was wounded twice more before the war ended, once in January 1945, once in March, but neither wound was life-threatening. He returned to Iowa in October 1945, married his high school sweetheart, and never spoke publicly about his combat service. His family learned about the Tiger engagement only after his death in 1993, when his wartime letters were discovered in an attic trunk. Private Tommy Sullivan, the bazooka gunner who made that first perfect shot, was killed 3 weeks later during the assault on the Siegfried Line. He was 22 years old. His Medal of Honor recommendation submitted by Mackenzie was downgraded to a Silver Star, which his parents received posthumously. The M1 and M9 bazookas remained standard U.S. infantry weapons through the Korean War, where they proved effective against T-34-85 tanks, though the Marines complained that their bazookas struggled with the T-34's armor, leading to the development of the improved 3.5-inch Super Bazooka. The original 2.36-inch launchers were finally retired in the 1960s. The Tiger tank's reputation underwent a fascinating transformation after the war. In the immediate post-war years, Allied veterans spoke of Tigers with a mixture of fear and respect. Tank commanders traded stories about encounters with the German behemoth. Hollywood picked up on this mystique, and by the 1960s, the Tiger had achieved legendary status in popular culture, but modern analysis paints a more nuanced picture. Tigers were formidable weapons when they worked, which was maybe 60% of the time. Their mechanical reliability was abysmal, their fuel consumption was catastrophic, and their tactical employment was often flawed. Germany built approximately 1,350 Tiger-Is during the war. By comparison, America built 49,234 Sherman tanks. The Tiger wasn't invincible. It was expensive, complicated, and vulnerable to tactics it wasn't designed to counter. Mackenzie proved that infantry armed with man-portable weapons and good tactics could level the playing field. Here's what happened to Tiger tactical doctrine after engagements like Mackenzie's. German commanders became increasingly paranoid about close-in infantry attacks. Tigers began moving only with heavy infantry screens, multiple layers deep, specifically to prevent bazooka teams from getting into flanking positions. This slowed German armor advances to a crawl and tied up enormous numbers of infantry that were desperately needed elsewhere. In other words, even when American bazookas didn't kill Tigers, the threat of them dramatically reduced Tiger effectiveness. The 4 Tigers destroyed at Mackenzie's Crossroads, assuming they were indeed Tiger-Is, which is probable given the date and location, represented roughly 0.3% of all Tigers ever built. Not statistically significant, but those for tanks also represented 6 months of production time, 1 million Reichsmarks worth of military hardware, years of crew training, and countless tons of fuel that Germany couldn't afford to lose. For the Americans, the cost was about $800 worth of bazooka rockets. The engagement showed something else, that infantry could fight armor on something approaching equal terms if they were well-trained, well-led, and aggressive. Mackenzie's dozen men held ground that textbooks said required a company of infantry with tank destroyer support. They did it with nothing more than standard infantry weapons and tactical creativity. Did you know that after the Battle of the Bulge, U.S. Army infantry schools added a section to their anti-tank training specifically covering flanking positions for multiple bazooka teams? The tactic Mackenzie improvised in frozen Belgian trenches became official doctrine. By March 1945, similar tactics were being used routinely across the Western Front. At Remagen, American infantry used coordinated bazooka teams to destroy Panther tanks attempting to eliminate the bridge. In the Ruhr pocket, bazooka teams accounted for dozens of armor kills. During the final drive into Germany, instances of bazookas destroying or disabling German tanks became so common that after-action reports barely mentioned them. It was just expected. The myth persisted, though. Even today, many people believe bazookas were ineffective against heavy German armor. Internet forums debate whether it was even possible for a bazooka to penetrate a Tiger. World War II video games often model bazookas as essentially useless against late-war German tanks, but the veterans knew different. In a 1989 interview, a 90th Infantry Division veteran named Robert Shaw put it bluntly, "Anybody who says the bazooka couldn't kill a Tiger never used one in combat. We knocked them out all the time. You just had to know where to shoot and have the balls to get close enough." The official U.S. Army historical record acknowledges dozens of confirmed Tiger kills by bazookas. The unofficial count instances documented in unit diaries, personal memoirs, and after-action reports that never made it into official statistics is probably 3 or 4 times higher, none of which makes the achievement any less impressive. Mackenzie and his 2 bazooka teams did something that military theory said was impossible. Using weapons that everyone said wouldn't work against targets that everyone said were invincible, they did it by refusing to believe what they were told and trusting what they could see. There's a broader lesson here about military technology and tactical innovation. Throughout history, new weapons are introduced with extraordinary claims. They're called war-winning, or invincible, or revolutionary. The Tiger tank was described in German propaganda as the ultimate weapon: unbeatable armor, unstoppable firepower. The technological superiority of German engineering made manifest, and for a while, it was terrifying. Shermans burned. Allied tank crews died. The Tiger's reputation grew with every engagement. But then someone like Corporal Mackenzie comes along. He doesn't have better weapons. He doesn't have superior technology. What he has is a refusal to accept that the problem is unsolvable. He looks at the Tiger not as an invincible monster, but as a machine with strengths and weaknesses. He figures out that the weakness isn't in the armor, it's in how the armor has to move. Tanks in column formation, infantry screening patterns, limited visibility, predictable tactics. These aren't weaknesses in the metal, they're weaknesses in the system. Enzi saw a system, then he broke it. This pattern repeats throughout military history. The invincible weapon meets the innovative tactic. The longbow defeats the mounted knight. The submarine defeats the battleship. The improvised explosive device defeats the armored column. The specific technologies change. The pattern doesn't. What Mackenzie proved on that frozen morning in December 1944 wasn't that Tigers were vulnerable or that bazookas were better than people thought. What he proved was that soldiers who think creatively will always find ways to defeat opponents who think conventionally. The Germans expected American infantry to either flee from Tigers or attempt futile frontal assaults. They did not expect communication trenches being used as concealed firing positions for coordinated flank attacks. Why would they? That's not what trenches were for. Mackenzie used them anyway. There's a photograph that survived from the aftermath, not of Mackenzie's specific engagement, but of a similar scene. A Tiger tank, abandoned, smoke still rising from the engine compartment. An American soldier standing next to it, examining the entry hole of a bazooka rocket. The soldier looks almost puzzled, as if he can't quite believe what he's seeing. That photograph could have been taken at Mackenzie's crossroads. It could have been taken at 100 different places across France, Belgium, and Germany in 1944 and 1945. Each time, the story was the same: infantry, armed with weapons that shouldn't work, defeating armor that couldn't be stopped. When German tankers climbed out of their damaged Tigers and saw the bazookas that had killed their vehicles, they were often shocked. Not because they didn't know bazookas existed, they'd captured plenty of them, tested them extensively. They knew the performance characteristics, the penetration values, the effective range. What shocked them was that American infantry had the courage to get that close. To wait in frozen trenches while 56 tons of steel rolled toward them. To hold fire until the perfect moment. To trust in their training and their tactics, even when every instinct screamed to run. That's not a technology problem. That's not even a tactics problem. That's a problem of human will who wants it more, who's willing to take the risk, who refuses to quit when the odds say they should. Mackenzie won, because he decided he was going to win. Then he figured out how. The bazookas just gave him the tools to do it. So the next time someone tells you that something can't be done, that the enemy is too strong, that your weapons aren't good enough, that the situation is hopeless, remember, a farm kid from Iowa who faced 4 Tiger tanks with 12 men and 2 bazookas and won, because the most dangerous weapon on any battlefield isn't the biggest gun or the thickest armor, it's the soldier who refuses to believe he's beaten.